Could you introduce us to you as a writer? Maybe like a little bit about your writing journey, what you love to write, and what you have
But
written.
I am self-published in terms of all of my book length work. And I'm traditionally published in terms of stories that I have out in the world. I enjoy working with editors on short works. It's fun because you're working in a more confined space, so to speak, textual space. And that to have two heads in there is a lot of fun, I think. And to just see how this in our case, very, very short piece can grow and evolve, with two people working together on it. That's just been really fun for me. In another life, I was a violin kid. I was a kid that started violin school when I was 4 years old. So there's a certain kind of, I guess, obsessive nature that I've developed from that with presentation. So I really like putting out my own book length works because it's not just the narrative, it's also the book itself as an object, whether it's an ebook or a paper book. I really enjoy making that happen as a whole. And I have a vision as a whole when I go into it. I'm sure you relate to this because like you're doing this anthology as a whole. If you fall in love with that process, it's really hard to say, oh, I'll yield cover or I'll yield even font. Like I'm obsessive about my fonts for the book projects. I'm sorry, we might get interrupted by a cat or two.
That's okay. We've got 3 dogs in the house, so
Okay.
it happens.
So I'm having the best time putting out these book projects that are really fun for me and constructions as a whole of like my creative vision, and then sending stories to editors who have fantastic ideas of their own and collaborating with them.
There's a new book out this year from University of Chicago Press called The Design of Books. And it was written by and designed by, of course, this is the book, The Design of Books. And the author is Debbie Byrne. And it is, first of all, it's a beautiful book. It is just, I mean, of course, it's really, really well designed, as it ought to be. The way that she works through all the different stages of book design, from the point of view of somebody who's done hundreds of these things, is really, really helpful. So you might want to check it out.
I absolutely will. Thank you for that. I haven't read it, and I have a whole design collection. I have a bunch of typography books, actually. That was like a minor obsession when I was in college. I would go to if you've been to Strand Books in New York.
I've seen it. I've never been inside Strand. I didn't have the time the last couple of times I was there, and I would love to, though.
Next time
one of the places I really want to get to.
Absolutely. Next time you visit us, make a stop. And if you go up to the second floor, I guess, all of their design books are kind of at the top of the staircase there. And I would just get up there, not be able to really move into fiction, even though that's what I was writing and reading, because there would just be this amazing wealth of texts about structure, form in a way that we don't think about as writers. But if you think about books as objects and art and visual art, and it was really, I would just spend hours there. So
there was another one I liked, but it's not so much the visual aspect as the internal structural aspect. Meander, Spiral, and Explode. It's a book about plots that are not lines.
Okay.
Just reading it had me thinking differently about how fiction works.
Yeah.
And that's, I mean, how stories work generally, whether fiction or non. And to come across something that actually changes how I understand, how I perceive stories is unusual, I'm sure you know, and it's definitely worth a look too.
The first academic conference paper I ever presented was on House of Leaves, so I definitely would want to read something like that. That sounds fantastic.
Do you have a certain genre that you write in more than others, or are you kind of all over the place?
I'm all over the place. I'm always in spec fic. I'm always speculative in some way, but I'm all over the place. Also, completely writing horror by accident. I never intend to. Like, it's to the point where like I'll send something to my critique partners and I'll get a text like, you didn't warn us and you did a scary again. And I was reading at night and I'm like, was it scary this time? And they'll be like, what's wrong with you? Like, why don't you know? Accidental horror writer, but it's been delightful to be an accidental horror writer. I scared so easily as a kid from certain things. And then from other things, I was like obsessed with the Gothic. So like terrified of Goosebumps, would cross the little library to like not walk by those. Reading scary stories to tell in the dark. And I think in a way those are a little bit more frightening. So
Oh, they're way scarier, I think.
I know it didn't make sense, but
I loved reading Goosebumps, and I would read not Are You Afraid of the Dark? That's a show I liked, but the Scary Stories to Tell in the Dark, I would read it only when I was feeling in my most secure and comfortable daylight storytelling. It was like, in the images in that book are genuinely frightening.
I
So you're
know.
saying you were more frightened of Goosebumps than of Scary Stories to Tell in the Dark?
I think I was frightened of the concept of Goosebumps. I was trying to talk this over with my husband, who also grew up loving Goosebumps. And I was
Yeah.
like, I don't know what it was that made me think that I couldn't handle horror, because I was reading the scary stories and I was reading Bunnicula, which, you know, is hilarious as an adult. But if you read it as a child and you're believing everything that dog is telling you, you know, that vampire bunny is like, she's scary. Like, you know, and those were the books that I was consuming. I don't know. I think maybe it was marketing. I said to him, it could have been just that the covers on Goosebumps were executed in such a way that I was like, oh, I won't be able to handle that. And the Schwartz seemed more manageable for whatever reason. I don't know.
My next question is, what are you reading now? Any recommendations for us? What's on your bookshelf?
Right now, I mean, I'm always, I'm so excited because Banana Yoshimoto, who's a Japanese, I guess, you know, they might categorize her as writing magically real stuff. I always think that term is a bit loaded. You know, realism with hints of whatever, if you want to call it spiritualism, speculative fiction, whatever you want to use, magically real. But she writes stunning prose, and I've loved her for years. She's one of my favorites. And she's suddenly getting translated more and more, because she has, I think, over 50 books at this point. And Italy loves her. They translate her like crazy. There's like 35 books translated into Italian or something like that. But we have like under 10. So it's been really, like, for a while I was like, I got to read her slowly because I'm going to burn through all her works and then I'm going to be devastated, and I don't read Japanese or Italian, so I'm going to be screwed. And then she started releasing in the last couple of years. Her next book I pre-ordered already. I think it's October or November, but I'm just thrilled that she's coming out with new material. So I'm actually catching up on her. I'm not reading the new stuff yet because I had been pacing myself with her her other stuff in translation. So I'm reading her again. And then I'm always reading a bunch of picture books because I'm a children's librarian in my day job. So reading new picture books. Jacqueline Woodson had a fantabulous one that I think was The World Belonged to Us, that I'm going to be probably doing for my first week of summer reading and the story time that I do with the kids. And that's really fun. That's about the city, but like, I want to say 50 years ago, a very different perspective on New York, and just the games that my folks and my aunts and uncles will tell me about that they played as children. So it's kind of cool to read something like that to the kids and see how they relate to it.
These books are not intended for children, but they are picture books. I don't think they qualify as graphic novels because they're just not laid out that way. But Sean Tan's books, Arrival and Cicada, and I don't know if there are any other from any others.
There's so many. I love him. I love him so much. I actually saw him speak at Scholastic almost 20 years ago. With Neil Gaiman and one other author, but I've loved him for I'm like thrilled that you brought him up because he's lesser known, because people don't know what to do. They say, I don't know if it's for children. I think he's brilliant for children. If you read the book, The Red Tree, which I don't think you can get on its own anymore. It's been anthologized in one of the books where they kind of lumped 3 or 4 of his picture books together, but it's about a child having a bad day. And it's like a really rough, overwhelming, it's a book of feelings of desperation and devastation and solace and like just loneliness and all these complex emotions that we think that small children can't experience. And of course they can. And at the end of the book, there's like a little, you know, some days are like this, but not every day. So you're fine, like, I guess, for parents, so that they're not like, why did you get my kid this book of devastation? But he's a genius. And if you like those, if you haven't done the Tales of Outer Suburbia collection yet, that's really fun. Rules of Summer is the one that I think when parents see it in a picture book collection, like, they get a little intense.
Yeah.
it's a little scary looking. He has I love him. Yeah. I think he's brilliant.
I keep him he was in my middle school classroom library and he's in my high school classroom library, and everybody loves him. It helps. I mean, he's not telling simple stories, but they're conveyed in a really clear way. And
Yeah.
so they're accessible sometimes when a student is just struggling for one reason or another and doesn't want to read anything. And I can hand them that book and they don't feel like I'm talking down to them, because it's not, there's nothing, it's not condescending to hand somebody such a complex story. Next up is to introduce us, if you would, to your story, The Scream. What was on your mind when you wrote it? If you're willing to share that kind of thing, and like what inspired it, or maybe give us the basic premise. I don't want to spoil or ruin anything that you don't want to reveal, but maybe somebody who's already read it comes to this interview and says, I wonder what that author was thinking. Or
I think if you are a commuter, especially in the summer, like it's great that we're coming into summer because these are the months that inspired this story. So I've always kind of lived / worked / existed between the burbs in Long Island and Queens and the rest of New York City. So I'm always between spaces. So that's been my kind of zone. And then when I was teaching at Rutgers, I was out in Jersey also. So that was like another kind of urban suburban space that I was going to regularly. And so a lot of that was done on public transportation. If you know New York City Transit, you've got your subways, you've got your Long Island Railroad, and you've got New Jersey Transit in what is now being quite renovated, like being fancied up a bit. But Penn Station was absolutely hell when I was there. It was not newly renovated. And it would get so hot and claustrophobic. I don't handle humidity well at all. This is not my favorite time of year. Despite the fact that we have ancestry in Puerto Rico and Colombia, whatever gene it is that helps a person handle humidity, I didn't get it. It skipped me. And so when I would have to be there, especially when I was carrying things, I would sometimes be like, this is ridiculous, but I'm not going to make it. I don't know how I'm going to make it in this space. I have to wait here for 40 minutes and it's hot. And I have a touch of claustrophobia, I think, with crowds. I don't like situations where people are crushed to death in a crowd. That's never going to happen to me, because if there's a crowd big enough to crush me to death, I'm not going to be anywhere near it. I remember I was seeing somebody in college. We were walking through Midtown around Christmas season, and we just happened to get near the big tree at Rockefeller Center. And he was like, "Oh, you want to go look?" And I turned my head and I saw just these bodies in front of us. I was like, you have to get me on a different street now. He was like, what's wrong with you? And I was like, you got to get me out of here right now. I cannot be here. It was just this overwhelming. So I think it was a combination of like my issues with crowds, with heat, with humidity, and a space that like really in terms of sensory elements can overwhelm a person. It's not just me. Like it is me, but it's also that space. Like if you go to that space and you're trying to get somewhere and it's rush hour and it's hot.
I'm getting like a traumatic response here because I've been through does Amtrak go through the basement of that building?
Yeah.
Yes. So I've arrived with my traveling with my backpacking pack, like during rush hour in the heat of the summer, because that's the only time I can really travel, maybe 5 or 6 different times. And every time I'm like, it's like a coffin, but really loud.
Yeah,
And
welcome to New York. It's hell, but we love it.
Appreciate that insight. I'm sorry if you had more to say about it.
No, not at all. Not at all. I'm sorry that that's your welcome every time you come. I can't promise you that it won't be.
I too don't go to the really crowded spaces. I don't like them, and I just don't go there. It's like when I went to the Louvre and I saw the Mona Lisa, I saw it from about 60 feet away, and there was this crush of bodies that I had no desire to enter. I didn't need to get closer to the Mona Lisa because all of those people were there, and that was much worse than not seeing the Mona Lisa.
I left that hallway because I had that experience a little in just the hall before you even got to them. I saw the crowd at the Mona Lisa. I was like, that's okay. I can see it on a postcard in the gift shop, and I just booked it the other way. Yeah. The hall, I found the artwork itself arranged in a really claustrophobic manner, because like these amazing paintings were just like touching each other. And I guess I'm spoiled. I'm used to the Met, and the Met doesn't do that. They do have like some close quarters, but whoever is there is probably also a Virgo and has to space things out just to a certain degree. So I ended up going to the African art work that's a level down in the Louvre, much less crowded and much, honestly, more beautifully displayed, in my opinion. Like I had a great time down there.
So I ended up in the ancient Assyrian and Neo-Babylonian like zone, where Ashurbanipal's Gate. Hammurabi's Code is in there, and there was nobody in that room.
I
And I'm
know.
like, dudes, it's the first like written code of laws. Like, this seems like a big deal. I get the Mona Lisa is really cool and everything, but this is really neat over here too. And there was nobody there to see these gates from, 3,000 years ago or 2,800 years ago or whatnot.
We shouldn't talk about it because everyone else will know, and the next time we go, all those places will be equally packed.
I think that people are intentionally just going to where the crowd is.
Yeah.
They're like, well, everyone must see the Mona Lisa, so I must go to that zone. When you tell people that you accidentally write horror or intentionally write horror or you read horror, sometimes folks get an impression in their mind. I mean, everybody has an idea in their head about what horror is. So I wonder, could you offer maybe like a working definition of what horror is for you? Or when you accidentally write it, what is that thing that you've accidentally done?
It's a question I love because when I was doing my first master's and throughout the PhD studies, I was working in Gothic studies. I really fell in love with the literary Gothic in undergrad during my study abroad, and I never fell out of love. And one of the first texts you're given if you study this is Edmund Burke's philosophical inquiry on the sublime and beautiful. And there are all these categories and requirements to establish the sublime, which is a feeling associated with the Gothic, right? So he has, everything from like magnitude, I think. I'm probably going to misquote because it's been a minute. I should reread it. But like magnitude, darkness, the cries of animals, like all of these criteria that help establish the experience of the sublime. I always have that in the back of my mind when the genre question comes up, because of course, like we do stipulate between those two, what we think of as contemporary horror and what we think of as the literary Gothic. But of course, they're friends, at least, or cousins, or quite closely related. I think there's definitely a genre in there. I like those texts where the genre mixes with other genres. I think in horror, like it's funny because certain genres, when they become cross genre, I think are just a little extra entertaining. Like, I don't know if you're watching the show Evil on Paramount Plus. Whoever's in the writer's room over there, they have a lot of whimsy at Paramount Plus. And I've noticed that this pervades a lot of the content that they put out. They're not afraid to be whimsical. They're not afraid to be quirkily funny. I think that for a lot of people who don't know horror well, those aren't two things that they would think would intersect. But I think if you do know horror well, you know that a lot of the best horror is when they do intersect. Like if you've seen some of the more frightening episodes of like the X-Files, like when they pick up on like, oh my gosh, like the vampire episode of the X-Files with Luke Wilson, hilarious, right? Like it's a fun, funny episode, and it gets to that humor because it is a horror episode, and it has chosen like one of the most classic figures, one of the classic monsters that we see in horror novels, the vampire, right? Like that's how we get there. I think there is a genre question there, and there are tropes that are really familiar to everybody. There are monsters that everybody knows about, but my favorite part of horror, which isn't quite your question, but a genre question is always a hard question to answer, is when horror starts to play in the sandbox with other genres. And I think that's how I end up accidentally writing it, because I think I'm doing something else. I think I'm doing, whoever else is the partner in play. And then the scary stuff just comes, and I don't even realize it half the time. Sometimes I've scared myself. I don't know if you've had that experience.
You're hitting on something that's really interesting to me, and that is when something is absurd, it's funny, but when it keeps going, it gets scary. If you ratchet up the absurdity to a certain point, it becomes frightening. It's certainly a thing I've seen work. And in particular, your mention of the X-Files makes me think of that. There's one called From Outer Space. It's something's from outer space. And it's really funny. And it's also kind of creepy. And it like teeters on the line. And the writer who did that episode did a bunch of other Monster of the Week type episodes for X-Files. And I know that person's writing is always going to be quirky in a funny way, as well as being genuinely creepy. It's even in the like reboot of the X-Files a couple of years back, that person wrote an episode or two of those were like ridiculous episodes. That's interesting, where we push and push and push a certain feeling to its extreme. And that actually kind of maybe speaks to your mention of Edmund Burke, who talked about, and I cheated and looked it up while you were talking, so don't think that I know this. He mentioned that the most extreme or intense emotion a person can feel is the sublime, and it's analogous to terror. And I don't know that that means they're the same thing. Like, I don't think he means that, but maybe he does. That is like, it's when we get to that really powerful version of an emotion, it can become overwhelming and then terrifying. If we love too much, or if we want too badly, I mean, those things taken to their extreme, they turn into sociopathy or vampires, or, you know, what have you. I love your riffing on it, and I appreciate it.
No, and when I'm glad you looked up his discussion of terror, because that's actually when I was teaching this to my undergrads, and we were doing intro level stuff. So I'm very hesitant to give hard definitions of anything in interviews, because of course context matters, and of course terms shift and can mean more than one thing at a time. But for the sake of argument, you have to teach the 19-year-old something, right? Like, so when I was teaching them and we were talking about the Gothic and we were talking about Burke, and I think I taught Castle of Otranto to start off with, but we talked about terror versus horror, in that horror is the thing where something external to you, like a monster or whatever, a skeleton, frightens you. But then terror is when you manage to frighten yourself, because it's whatever is internal to you, whatever trauma, whatever baggage informs how you are going to respond to your surroundings. And then you kind of incite this emotion of feeling terrified. Like, you know, like my claustrophobia, like most people go to see that Christmas tree and they're like, oh, it's so wonderful. Remember Home Alone? And like, you know, like, and I'm there like, oh my God, there's so many people, get me out. Like, this is not, that's me, right? Like, I've terrified myself. That's not, nobody's come for me.
If you haven't read Buellman's Those Across the River, it's a lovely Southern Gothic werewolf tale. And it's a new take. And it like has, there's social criticism, of course, in there too, and it's modern. Wondering what drew you to submit to Costs of Living. Whisper House Press is not like a known entity. We're a nothing. So how did you find it, and what drew you to submit to it?
You're not a nothing. Published to death.blogspot.com knows you exist. I think they put the call up. It's either their submission grinder. That's where I generally look when I'm looking for homes for my short stories that haven't found a home yet. And I saw the call, and it's unusual for me to shop shorter stuff. To have flash has been unusual for me. I have the last story I had out in January was also flash. So it's working for me, where I'm like, okay, well, I guess what I have to do is just shut up a little bit and write less, and just, but you know, yeah, no. So I saw the call on either, I think it was published to death. I don't think it was submission grinder.
Did you know when you read the call, like, oh, this story in particular is like a good fit for this?
Yeah, usually I try to find a good fit, because I think that, like, you know, if you're actively submitting, you know that the most common form rejection you're going to get is not quite the right fit for this call.
Not a good fit. Yeah.
Yeah. And you know, I think that I like to take people at their word. I don't think it's just blowing smoke at somebody. I think that, like, not a right fit means not a right fit. So you want to try to find something that does fit. This story, it was funny because this is a recent resurrection. I had written this a long time ago, actually, when I was fresh out of my MFA program and didn't know what I was doing at all. Tucked it away.
It does not show.
Thank you. I appreciate that. But I when I resurrected it took some major changes, especially like title and conclusion, because I had thought it was a monster story. I had thought it was a banshee story. And then I was like, I think that's a little oversimplistic. I need to take a step back.
Yeah. It really works as it is now, and kudos on the changes. I have similar experiences. So what's next for you? This video probably won't come out for months and months. So let's talk in terms of the next year or two. Do you have any particular goals in mind, particular book that you're working on, or just like, do you have a certain kind of, I want to write this many stories, or anything like that?
No, absolutely. I have. So the wisdom when you're indie, when you're self-published, the wisdom that I've been getting, I listen to a lot of podcasts, Joanna Penn, of course, but also there's the Six Figure Authors podcast, which is a trio of really great writers who are giving good sound advice. And it was one of those days where things come together, and the three podcasts that I was listening to, which were not recorded at all in the same year or anything, but those, like, I happened to hit on 3 episodes in one day where they all said you need to get to like 10 books before the
front list sells backlist.
Yes.
Yeah.
And the 10 book line, everyone was saying, like, get to 10 books. So I'm on this 10 book plan right now. 4 out, 2 novellas, 1 novel, 1 story collection. This collection I've been sitting on for 5 years at least, that I really adore, but I want to do right. It's kind of an homage to, and I've been saying an homage to and a clapback at Bradbury. I guess I'll talk about it. So if you've read, of course, Something Wicked This Way Comes, or The Illustrated Man. The character of The Illustrated Man inspired this book, and this book is The Illustrated Woman. I didn't want to do 18 stories, which is what Illustrated Man has. It was like, that's too much for me. So I've got 9, which also has a nice, symmetry to it. J.D. Salinger did 9 stories, right? Of course, famously. So I have my 9 stories and my frame narrative about this illustrated woman at a carnival whose tattoos allow you to see into these worlds that are the stories themselves. I wanted to kind of, the clapback aspect of this book is, if you read the frame narrative of Illustrated Man, the Illustrated Man is going to kill the protagonist. That's what he sees in the tattoo on his back, like in this glimpse of the future. He sees the scene of his own murder and goes to escape the Illustrated Man. I really wanted to not do that. I wanted to have someone who, because life is traumatic enough. So if you're seeing in these tattoos glimpses and aspects of experience that are traumatic, then the experience of the woman who has these immersive tattoos that show you, that reveal things to you, that should be more about recovery, more about healing. So that's my little pushback, but the stories are all done. I just got permissions from Norton to quote an E.E. Cummings poem, which made me so happy, because I was like, oh gosh, I really like quoted material so hard when you're publishing, and even harder if you're an indie. It was a yes, so that's great. So I'm hoping that book will be out in December.
Cool.
For it then, I'm going to be sending to Kirkus and Booklist and all those folks.
Have you had stuff with Booklist and Kirkus before? Speaking as an indie author, I got my this one, which I just so happen to have it right next to me because I signed it for my son today. But he and I are going to Europe next month for a 4-week trip, and I told him 3 hours a day we're reading, and he was like, oh.
I mean, but it's great to read in Europe because you can read anywhere.
Yeah.
Read in these really scenic places that you want to travel to. So
that's what I like to do. I walk around, and then when I feel like this is a good spot, I just plant myself there. I went through Kirkus. I was too late for Booklist because I was within 60 something days or something. Anyways, I have a very clear picture of what is required for the future. Like for this book, we have 1.5 years until publication. The book design should be done in December, which will give us, give me 9 months to make sure that everything looks great. The galleys are perfect. Like the physical thing looks great. We fix anything if we have to fix something. And then there's like a 6-month window where I can send out arcs, and like that's the goal. And I have everything plotted out in a very careful, like project management outline type thing. And so I'm proud of that. But it sounds like you did it the right way.
Kirkus is, I find them to be very generous. They've reviewed all of my books, and favorably, which is kind, because librarians do call them Cranky Kirkus. That's the nickname.
Yeah.
So
yeah, I loved my Kirkus review. I was so proud of it when it came out. And they called it clever and setting a very high bar for future stories in the landscape and whatever. It was cool. It's just so nice to have some kind of validation.
No, and absolutely, because they're their knee jerk is to be a little mean over there. So when Kirkus gives you a thumbs up, it's a real thumbs up.
Yeah.
It's quite validating.
Where can we find you and your work?
So I am always at abookbumble, because Melissa means bee. So I'm always abookbumble, ABOOKBUMBLE, on Twitter, or I guess we're calling it X now. Twitter, Instagram, Pinterest, even. I have some bookish stuff up there. WordPress. That's abookbumble.com is my website.
Is there anything else you want to chat about? Anything I'm forgetting?
I don't think so. Thank you so much. It's been really great to talk to you. I don't think I realized you were a teacher, and it's always fun to talk to somebody else who's in education and who works with kids.
Thank you very much, Melissa, for joining us. Thank you for submitting to the Anthology Costs of Living, and we wish you all of the successes, and especially for this story in this anthology, we really want you to win all of the awards that are available to win.
Thank you for that, and thank you for having me. I'm really excited to see it come out. I think it's going to be fantastic.
Me too. Thank you so much.